Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us and welcome to Anderson House. My name is Andrew Outen and I'm the Historical Programs Manager for the American Revolution Institute of the Society of the Cincinnati. The American Revolution Institute promotes knowledge and appreciation for the achievement of American independence by supporting advanced study, developing exhibitions and other historical programs and tours, advocating historic preservation, and providing resources to classrooms nationwide that benefit teachers, students, and scholars alike. Since 1938, the Society of the Cincinnati has done all of this work from right here at its headquarters, Anderson House, a National Historic Landmark that was completed in 1905 as the winter residence of Lars and Isabel Anderson here in Washington, D.C. Today's Lunch Bite features Emily Parsons discussing the history of the Society of the Cincinnati's Eagle insignia designed by Pierre-Charles L'Enfant in 1783, while exploring various types of the Society insignia produced in the 20th century and the famous men who wore them, including Harry Truman, Winston Churchill, and Ronald Reagan. Emily is the Institute's Deputy Director and Curator. Having joined the staff here at Anderson House in 2003, she oversees the Institute's museum programs, including its collections, exhibitions, and public events, as well as the interpretation of Anderson House. Her research interests include the history and material culture of the Revolutionary era and the cultural history of Gilded Age America, especially art collecting practices. She is also known for her expertise surrounding Society of the Cincinnati Eagle insignias, so I can assure you that you are all in more than capable hands when it comes to today's subject matter. But before I turn things over to Emily, the usual housekeeping items are in order for our virtual attendees joining us on Zoom this afternoon. Following today's lunch bite, there will be a question and answer session, so please feel free to submit your questions for Emily at any point during the presentation by using the question and answer function that can be found at the bottom of your screen. And we will, as always, do our best to incorporate them with our live audience questions. Should you have any technical related questions or comments, those can be submitted using the chat function, and one of our staff members will be monitoring that and will do their best to assist you. So without further delay, please join me in welcoming to the lectern Emily Parsons.
Good afternoon. Thank you, everyone, for being here and tuning in. The Society of the Cincinnati Eagle insignia is among the most precious objects to us and one of my favorite things to talk about. So I'm excited to be able to do this today. The Society Eagle, as it's known, encapsulates the ideals of the organization in a beautiful symbolic package, and wearing it displays a member's commitment to the legacy of the American Revolution. We believe we have the largest collection of Society Eagles in the world, as I think we should, and have more than 70 examples, from the first Eagles made in January 1784 to types made just a few years ago. And as a note, all of the examples and the images that you'll see in today's presentation are from our collections. Most of the time, we focus on eagles from the Society's founding era, from the late 18th and early 19th centuries. So I'm excited today to shift gears a bit and talk more about the more modern history of the eagle in the 20th century. And this builds on themes in our current exhibition, Affairs of State, 118 Years of Diplomacy and Entertaining at Anderson House, which highlights events that have taken place since Anderson House has been the Society's headquarters since 1938, and displays several of the eagle types that I'll be talking about today. But to start briefly about the eagle and the Society itself to give us grounding for where we go in the 20th century. The eagle is, of course, the insignia of membership in the Society of the Cincinnati, which was founded May 13th, 1783, so just had our 240th birthday, to promote the memory and ideals of the American Revolution and to maintain the fraternal bonds of the officers. It was founded by officers of the Continental Army while encamped along the Hudson River in the last months of the war. Ultimately, the Society would have a little over 2,200 original members who were officers of the Continental Army and Navy, as well as their French counterparts. Part of the Society's identity has always been recognizing the importance of the French participation in the achievement of American independence. And there have been French members since the beginning. So original members include men like George Washington, Henry Knox, Nathaniel Greene, James Monroe, James Peel, John Paul Jones, the Baron von Steuben, Comte de Rochambeau, Marquis de Lafayette, Comte d'Estaing, and the Comte de Grasse. The society was founded as a hereditary organization, so that in future generations, there would be this built-in community of members, descendants of those original officers, who hopefully would feel a responsibility in their generation to carry forward the society's work. This has been going on now for more than 2 centuries, and the society now has more than 4,000 members. The society is and always has been divided into 14 constituent societies, one for each of the original 13 American states and one for France. That will come into play as we start talking about these eagle variations. So the eagle was first described in the institution, the founding document of the society, drafted by Henry Knox in April and May of 1783, and engrossed on parchment. And it says, "The society shall have an order by which its members shall be known and distinguished, which shall be a medal of gold, of a proper size to receive the emblems, and suspended by a deep blue ribbon 2 inches wide, edged with white, descriptive of the Union of France and America." So pretty specific, although leaves up to artistic interpretation exactly what this would look like. General Steuben, who was president pro tem of the society at the time, asked Pierre-Charles L'Enfant, who he had had on his staff and worked with during the Revolution, and knew of his artistic abilities, asked him to turn Knox's words into a design which was adopted by the society in June of 1783. And this is what that design looked like. L'Enfant did this in watercolor, double-sided, as the medal itself would be, and he followed Knox's description and guidance from the institution, also taking inspiration from both the royal orders of Europe and the new Great Seal of the United States, which had been adopted just the previous year in 1782. Knox, when he was writing the institution, imagining this medal, was imagining a circular medal, which would have been much more recognizable and common in America. But what L'Enfant created, again, with his European sort of artistic background, was this much more dynamic, distinctive, and deeply symbolic insignia that would become well known on both sides of the Atlantic. And L'Enfant, in terms of choosing the American bald eagle to be the shape of this medal, L'Enfant called it a bird unique to this continent and felt strongly that that should be the identity that this medal should have. In the oval medallions on the breast of both sides of the eagle, L'Enfant followed the institution's more explicit description of the emblems, as they were called, which L'Enfant depicted on both sides. And the institution's description is: "The principal figure Cincinnatus, 3 senators presenting him with a sword and other military ensigns. On a field in the background, his wife standing at the door of their cottage, near it a plow and instruments of husbandry. Round the whole, omnia reliquit servare rem publicum." And that's the obverse that you're seeing on the left side. On the right side, you're seeing the reverse. "Sun rising, a city with open gates and vessels entering the port. Fame crowning Cincinnatus with wreath inscribed Virtutis Premium. Below, hands joined, supporting a heart, with the motto Esto Perpetua, round the whole Societas Cincinnatorum Instituta AD 1783. So L'Enfant insisted to the society's officers that only French craftsmen had the ability to create and to turn his design into gold medals. The society's leaders deferred to him and approved his proposed trip to France. Washington and Knox instructed him very specifically to do 3 things in France: to have eagles made to fulfill American orders that he had taken in advance, to have eagles made to present to a specific set of, I think, 6 or 7 French officers and diplomats, high-ranking ones who had been specifically named in the institution and honored in that way as members, as well as to have another set of eagles made specifically to present to French officers to encourage their interest in the society. And then thirdly, to have a copper plate made to print the diploma of membership. So L'Enfant arrived in Paris in late December 1783, and very early the next year, a set of Parisian goldsmiths, Nicolas Jean Francastel and Claude Jean Autran Duval, manufactured the first eagles. These craftsmen translated L'Enfant's drawing into a double-sided gold enameled medal suspended by a gold ring from a blue and white silk ribbon. And they had to make a few modifications to turn L'Enfant's drawing into a more functional, a little bit more elegant, three-dimensional object. So you'll see in this slide, we've got, looking at the obverse, L'Enfant's drawing on the left, one of those first French eagles on the right, and they ended up adding a wreath over the eagle's head, so you didn't have the suspension ring just coming out of its head. That was the main change. And so what you're seeing here is from a batch of 45 eagles, the first made beginning in January 1784. And these were among those intended for French officers. A group was in mid-January distributed by Lafayette to French officers who had served under American command. And then Rochambeau distributed more a day later to French officers serving for the king. These are just over an inch high, by the way, excluding the ribbon. L'Enfant also had to arrange for eagles to be made to fulfill the orders that Americans had placed before L'Enfant left for France. There were 40 of these examples. So you're seeing one on the right compared with one of those first small French eagles on the left. And so because there was more space on this is a half an inch taller, which may not seem like a lot, but when you're talking about things this small, I mean, that's a third larger than the one on the left. There was more room to sort of express more of L'Enfant's specific design. And this one on the right sort of became the standard kind of iconic society eagle in the 18th century and beyond, because of its graceful proportions. This elegant elongated neck would also become a hallmark of later French versions, as we'll see. Within 6 months of L'Enfant's French eagles arriving in Philadelphia in the spring of 1784, Jeremiah Andrews produced the first American-made society eagles in that city. So what you're seeing on the right-hand side of this slide is one of those American-made eagles by Andrews that, even though we're still talking about something all derived from L'Enfant's design, if you take a step back, these all look to be the same insignia, very, very similar, but once you drill down, Andrews' eagle is actually quite a departure in style from the French eagles. It's more robust, more assertive. It's got broader wings. It actually is another half an inch higher than the larger of the French eagles, so it's getting bigger. And these much bigger, rounder medallions that for the first time really could carry the full scope of L'Enfant's original design for the scenes of Cincinnatus in that medal. Members have always had to pay for an eagle, which during the founding period would cost anywhere from $17 to $26, depending on the maker and the style, with the exception of honorary members and maybe a few others whose eagle was usually presented to them at no cost. So the eagle over its history has been made by craftsmen in America and in France for more than 200 years. Each craftsman was building on the designs that came before him, choosing to embrace the general style, but tossing out elements he didn't like or thought he could improve on. But all of these were always remaining faithful to L'Enfant's original design and vision. Over its history, some eagles were commissioned by those constituent societies or the general society, some created by craftsmen themselves, just marketing directly to society members. And then a handful of others have been commissioned by individual society members, really taking it upon themselves to produce an eagle of their own design. This has resulted in about 45 different types that we know of, all based on, again, L'Enfant's original design, but with their individual quirks. And I put this slide together not to show you what's most common, most typical, most kind of thought of as a standard eagle, but some of those quirkier, less common, more unusual varieties to show you just that, the variety. From in the upper left, the first eagles made in 1784 to bottom right into the 20th century. By the mid-19th century, more than half of the society's branches had gone dormant, and overall membership was at only several hundred people. The revival of dormant constituent societies beginning in the 1870s inspired a proliferation of new eagle types that would carry into the 20th century. So if you forgive me, I'm sort of looking at the long 20th century. So we'll start in the late 19th century here. Most eagle types have been commissioned by American state societies, but these are from a group of French eagles made in the second half of the 19th century that are curious because we haven't been able to document their origins, who commissioned them and why, especially because the French society wasn't reconstituted until the 1920s. So there was no formal French society to even be commissioning these. As you can see, there are significant differences even within this group of eagles. Even in materials, the one on the left you see is silver gilt rather than the usual gold. And their general design as a whole is again another departure from those 18th century eagles, probably though taking inspiration loosely from those very first small French eagles. There is at least one documented instance of Tiffany, an American firm, importing some of these late 19th century French eagles in 1887 to sell here in America. There may be other instances of that. Speaking of Tiffany, they were the most prominent firm making the Society Eagle at the beginning of the 20th century. They had begun by the 1880s with a commission from the newly reorganized Rhode Island Society. And they produced this really elegant, refined, finely made design that set a new standard for craftsmanship for the eagles. This is mostly a new version, I think, although with similarities to Andrew's 18th century eagle, that larger, broader, more sort of expressed oval medallion designs. Lars Anderson, who had this house built in 1905, owned this example. And we'll see him wearing it here on the left. He was very proud of his membership in the society, and this is one of at least 4 portraits that I know of that he commissioned in which he's wearing the eagle. He had it on a neck ribbon. We saw that long kind of V-shaped ribbon, so he's wearing it just at below his top buttonhole. And then on the right-hand side, you actually also see his wife, Isabel, wearing that same eagle. This was possible because after Lars's death, when Isabel, following his instructions, donated Anderson House to the Society of the Cincinnati, the society named her what they called an honorary associate in appreciation for this really important gift of this headquarters. And that honorary associate went along with the right to wear her late husband's eagle. As far as I can tell, this is the only time the society has given permission for a woman, a non-member, to wear its insignia. So significant there. Society leaders emerged from the 19th century with a hope of standardizing both the eagle insignia and its ribbon, which some vocal members thought suffered from a noticeable, quote, want of uniformity, as the 19th century was this sort of wild, wild west of state societies commissioning variations that got even farther from L'Enfant's design. You have the French examples in the second half of the 19th century of individuals commissioning their own that got bigger and bigger. So they're wanting to rein this in. During the triennial meeting of 1890, a committee was formed to, quote, fix upon a die as a standard for the eagle of the order. Those delegates at this meeting also resolved to standardize the process of obtaining an eagle, which had also been just all over the place. And their hope was for the General Society to oversee the whole process. Wherever the inspiration for a new type came from, an individual, a state society, they wanted to have the authority to approve it. Then they wanted to be the ones to procure the actual eagles and also document which members were buying what. So the General Society received dies from several different makers for eagle designs for this hoped for standard eagle. And in 1902, they chose the one submitted by Bailey, Banks and Biddle of Philadelphia, which was adopted by the triennial meeting of that year. So what you're seeing here is that so-called standard eagle. This has a more modern feel to it than previous society eagles. There was an attempt to have a more naturalistic head to the eagle, and there's some references to Bailey, Banks and Biddle's designer actually going to the Philadelphia Zoo and observing bald eagles in order to make his design. It's distinguished by these really really long pointed wings, as well as this spiral suspension loop, which was also at this time sort of a new development, transferring the eagle from a ribbon and off of it again easier. There was also a miniature version, half the size. And we do know that British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who was elected a hereditary member of the Connecticut Society in 1947, owned, among the 2 eagles he owned, one of those standard eagle miniatures. It's now preserved in the collection of Chartwell, which is a National Trust site in England. We also know that US President Benjamin Harrison is said to have owned a standard eagle preserved at the Benjamin Harrison Presidential Site in Indiana. He was elected an honorary member of the Pennsylvania Society in 1889. And curiously, he died in 1901, a year before this eagle was adopted. So I wonder if it was presented to his family posthumously, since he died 1 year before this happened. And so here's the miniature. And for those of you here at Anderson House, I did bring out a few examples in addition to what's on display in the exhibition upstairs, and we have the miniature here. So if you want to see just how miniature it is, we'll have that in person. So despite the unanimous votes of the delegates at the Society's triennial meetings to adopt the standard eagle, many other members appear not to have wanted one standard eagle, or if they did, they didn't want it to be that design. New types commissioned by state societies quickly followed the creation of the standard eagle from Georgia, North Carolina, New Hampshire, Virginia, Connecticut, New York, and Delaware, clearly not embracing a standard eagle. Many of these new state types replicated designs from the Society's early history, like this one commissioned by the North Carolina Society in 1904. And it was a joint project with the Georgia Society, which 2 years earlier had commissioned the same maker to produce an eagle modeled after Jeremiah Andrews' 18th century design. Even using a specific example that one of their members owned that had been owned by John Berrien, who was an original member of the Georgia Society. So this North Carolina eagle of 1904 does replicate the general style of that Andrews eagle, which you see on the right, but they're easy to distinguish by the plain head that you get on the Georgia eagle, the elongated medallions that are skinnier, as well as just this overall kind of modern, more precise appearance that you get in the tooling of the wings and other aspects of the eagle that you can tell so for all these eagles we're looking at late 19th and into the 20th centuries, these are made but using dies, and so striking the eagles as a single piece from those dies, whereas in the 18th century, both in France and America, those eagles would have been handmade. Very remarkably similar from different makers, but still could have slight little variations just by virtue of being made that way. We know that US President Woodrow Wilson owned one of these North Carolina eagles, preserved at the President Wilson House, which is in our neighborhood here in DC. He became an honorary member in 1913 of 3 different state societies who I guess were fighting over making him an honorary member from Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina. So this and other state types that would appear in this period were in conflict with the General Society's new authority to approve new designs and to be the one to place orders with the manufacturers that had been adopted at the 1902 triennial. The Society's Assistant Treasurer General, who was the general officer who was in charge of all of these matters related to the eagles, repeatedly reminded the states that producing their own eagle without the General Society's approval was, quote, an infringement of the rules. But he never went any farther, and the march of state eagles continued. The Virginia Society's treasurer at this time, Heth Lorton, was one of the members who advocated for a standard eagle. But he's one of the ones who did not approve of the Bailey, Banks, and Biddle eagle as it was, quote, not in accordance with the design of Major L'Enfant, which design Lorton mistakenly argued had specifically been prescribed by the institution. And of course, the institution laid out the general parameters for the eagle, but did not specifically enumerate the design that L'Enfant created. So Lorton campaigned vigorously against constituent societies creating their own eagle types, quote, according to their own ideas on the subject, as well as for the return to the L'Enfant design as the sole version of the insignia. He sent, under his own name, as well as the Virginia Society's name, a circular letter out to other state societies in 1905, advocating in very strong terms for his opinions about the eagle, which drew a strong and I think uncharacteristically aggressive response from at the time, the President General of the organization, basically asking him to cease and desist doing this. So curiously, the following year, 1906, the Virginia Society, of which he newly has been appointed secretary, commissions it for its first eagle, which looks like this, straying even farther from L'Enfant's original design. This was made by Alva Nelson in New York, and were not terribly large in size, but quite thick, and cost $40, which became controversial at the time, one of the most expensive eagles for sale then. This example we have in our collections, it was actually owned by Heth Lorton. And what makes me chuckle is that he owned two other examples of the Society Eagle, none of which the standard eagle, which makes sense, although for him to have argued for a single standard design and then own three completely different ones, sort of makes you scratch your head. By 1920, the Delaware Society had commissioned its own design from a Philadelphia firm, which is moving us a little closer to that 18th century L'Enfant eagle. It's got the overall similar shape and proportions, although it's on the whole larger, noticeably larger. It's the largest regular issue of the eagle that's ever been made, excepting a few quirky kind of individual commissions that are larger. It's got this really large, prominent wreath, a thicker neck and head, and the medallions themselves are larger with more specifically designed scenes in them. Around the same time the Delaware Eagle was designed, the New York Society was exploring commissioning a new design themselves. The New York Society had regularly been commissioning types of the eagle since 1800. And they decided they needed to replace their worn out dies. So like Heth Lorton of Virginia, the New Yorkers embraced reviving the L'Enfant eagle. Instead of commissioning a new design inspired by the 18th century eagle type or L'Enfant's watercolor, they actually located one of the original L'Enfant eagles that was still owned by one of their members and had theirs reproduced from that. So it's the closest we've come so far to replicating the L'Enfant design. Tiffany first produced the dies, but by the 1930s, the New York Eagle was being made by Bailey, Banks, and Biddle. And so here I've got the 1919 New York Eagle side by side with one of the L'Enfant 1784 Eagles. And as you can see, they are much closer, although there are still sort of easy ways to tell the difference between the two. The 1919 design has this elongated pattern of feathers on the neck and more uniform feathers on the tail, and both in gold, not in black. And the 1919 also has these smaller block printed letters in the medallions. So along these same lines, by the mid-1930s, the society itself conceded that the standard eagle was not popular, and the effort to establish one and only one eagle for their members had failed. Its officers agreed to produce a new eagle replicating the 18th century L'Enfant eagle as closely as possible. And they actually found 5 original L'Enfant eagles owned by members and chose the one owned by Tench Tillman, which you're seeing at left, as the one to specifically replicate. It was still in the family at the time, owned by a member of the Maryland Society, Harrison Tillman, who would later give it to the society in the 1950s. So that's how it's in our collections, although it wasn't at the time that this replica was made. And we have a much closer reproduction than the New York Eagle when you see them all side by side. But there's still some tells that it's not one of these 18th century eagles. There's this greater uniformity in general in the leaves of the wreath, in the wings themselves. It looks like a more modern production than those 18th century eagles. And for lack of like a more kind of exact description, It just looks like he has kind of an angrier face to me on the right. These were also made by Alvin Nelson in New York, who had made the Virginia Eagle 30 years earlier. They were first made in 1937, and then the dies transferred to A.H. Fetting of Baltimore just a year later. They made them until 1947. Bailey, Banks, and Biddle picked up production of the Tench Tillman Eagle, as it was called, in 1950, and they're still made today by a company named City Pride out of Jenkintown, Pennsylvania. Now, Winston Churchill, his second eagle that he owned, was this Tench Tillman type, and he received it here at Anderson House in 1952 when he was here to give a speech to not just society members, but members of American government, the British diplomatic staff, and others on the historic relationship between the United States and Great Britain, which he did in our ballroom, which you're seeing on the right of your screen. And while he was here, he was presented with the Eagle and diploma of the society as a hereditary member, as his mother was American, and through her family, there were American patriots who fought for American independence in his family line. So his eagle, again, preserved in England, of this type. US President Herbert Hoover also received one of these eagles presented to him about 1950, a year after he was made an honorary member of the Connecticut Society, and that's now preserved at the Herbert Hoover Library. So to wrap up, one more type here I want to show you. Despite the General Society's commitment to the L'Enfant eagle that they finally got to in the 1930s, a different kind of eagle type appeared by mid-century. At the 1947 triennial meeting, Vice President General Edgar Erskine Hume reported that he had recently been in France and purchased from the jeweler Arthus Bertrand a silver gilt eagle. And he liked this eagle so much that he proposed that the society should purchase more of these and make silver gilt eagles available to its members, as they would be cheaper than gold. I think at the time they were, eagle sales had really slowed. And Hume's theory was that members didn't want to purchase an expensive gold eagle, but maybe they would want to purchase a much less expensive silver gilt. And he also thought for some reason that these would be cheaper coming from France than to make in the US. And the meeting approved Hume's proposal and authorized him to go back to France, purchase 50 of these, and bring them back for sale. They did concede that while they preferred members to wear a gold eagle, that silver gilt would be better than none at all. The idea of silver gilt eagles became controversial, and some cited the institution as specifying that the institution would be made of gold, which it does say. And they argued that any adoption of a silver gilt eagle would be, quote, illegal. Various silver gilt eagles had actually existed since at least the mid-19th century, as others actually at this meeting pointed out. One of them was even being made by Bailey, Banks, and Biddle at the time, and the delegates to the 1953 triennial meeting went so far as to resolve that they tell Bailey, Banks, and Biddle to stop producing that silver gilt eagle. This controversy was so upsetting to Hume that while he had gone to France and bought the 50 that he had been authorized to buy, he ended up buying them from the society because he didn't want this controversy to follow these eagles and mean that maybe they never saw the light of day. So it's actually unclear to me, the documentation I've seen sort of drops off at this point, presumably leaving these eagles in the hands of one of their individual officers. So I don't know if he was individually selling these eagles that he had bought, or if somehow they do make their way back to the society and the society's authorized selling them, and I just haven't found that documentation. What we see here is that it's very similar to that Delaware eagle, that large eagle that was starting to get back to the L'Enfant design. Although this one is a little heavier in appearance, you've got an even thicker neck, and the material itself, of course, is a dead giveaway of who made this eagle. And depending on the example, you'll start to see that silver tarnish and come through the gilt surface. The history of its manufacture is also a little uncertain to me. When Hume said initially he had been in France and bought one of these eagles, he doesn't say whether he specifically asked the maker to produce an eagle like this for him, and it was a one-off at that point, or if Arthur Bertrand somehow was already making this eagle and he just happened to buy one of them to show the Americans. So that's not clear. And it's also unclear if Arthur Bertrand made more than just those 50 that Hume bought in 1947, whether just deciding to do it on their own or whether they actually got more commissions, either from Hume or others in the society. And I assume they did for two reasons. If we assume he only bought 50 in 1947, I can document at least 23 available. There's actually one on eBay right now, as we were discussing. They come up very often, much more often than they should, considering what I'm used to for other types of the eagle, which survive at much lower rates than that. So it seems like an unusually high number to have survived if only 50 were made. And also just learned yesterday that Arthur Bertrand will still make the eagle on demand today. So I don't know how long they've been doing that, but more research to be done. One member who owned one of these Arthur Bertrand eagles is General George C. Marshall, who became an honorary member of the Virginia Society in 1939, and that's kept in a private collection. So to wrap up again with my favorite slide, the story of the Society Eagle in the 20th century is largely one focused on the Society's attempt to use a single standardized insignia. But even though that failed, what resulted was a colorful array of variations that brought identity and pride to different constituent societies as well as individual members. And I think the proliferation of these different types actually spread the eagle, which is the society's most recognizable symbol, farther and wider, and with it exposing more people to the organization, its history, and its mission. And as I mentioned with the Arthur Bertrand eagle, for a variety of these eagle types, there are gaps in what we currently know or have been able to document, but other avenues for research. So I would hope to fill in and know even more about how some of these came to be or how long they've been existing as we go forward. So thank you very much for your patience and for listening, and be happy to answer any questions. Mm-hmm. That's interesting that you bring that up. I was actually just looking into that this morning. So I know of 5 swords, so-called presentation swords, that have been inscribed to individual members of the society, original members from the society, and all or almost all of them have an eagle inscribed on the scabbard. I've not been able to figure out their story. I haven't found, at least readily accessible, I have not found in the General Society's minutes or meeting proceedings reference to any of these swords, to resolving to award a sword to a certain member. The ones I know exist, a few of them are famous names, a few of them are members who probably didn't even hold a society office, or why they're not really all of the same status. So why these people, and there may be more out there that I don't know of as well. I'd love to, if you know of one, I'd love to know about it. So unfortunately, I mean, the swords themselves seem to be early 19th century swords. They all have an eagle head pommel and other similar characteristics, but although they're not all identical. So that bears some more research as well. The eagle image itself has found its way onto all sorts of goods over the years, on certainly porcelain and other ceramics, on swords, as we mentioned, as you get closer to the 20th century, on tobacco cards or tobacco silks that ended up in packs of cigarettes. Yeah.
Are some of the medals different for those that were higher in rank, for instance? Are there differences between the eagles or?
Good question. No, the only exception being the Diamond Eagle of the society that was made specifically for Washington and then became the badge of the office of the President General. That's the only of these eagle types that that was distinguished for a specific officer. I should have said that regardless of which state society was commissioning any of these eagle types, it didn't mean that only members of that state society could purchase it. Generally, any of the members, regardless of constituent society, could buy a New York eagle, a Delaware eagle, etc. So that was not restrictive. What was the name? Spink. I'm not familiar with that. The question was, did a spink in England reproduce an eagle in the last 20, 30 years? I'm not aware. Yes.
Is there any reason why not every state society has up with its own design?
Right. So why not every state has commissioned its own eagle type is a good question. You know, not more than half of them have, but not every one. And what has struck me is that Rhode Island and Delaware, that have always been the two smallest by far state societies, they went and made two of the most prominent eagles that we've ever had. I mean, Rhode Island in 1877, I think, just reconstituted. I mean, did they have a dozen members? They probably had more, but they were so small, yet they go to Tiffany and say, make us this eagle. And it becomes just one of the most iconic, beautiful eagles that's ever been made. And it goes on to be made for 30 or more years. And then Delaware, haven't figured out who the original maker of the Delaware Eagles is yet, but they're also always been a very small society. And they go and commission the largest of the standard eagle types that's ever been made. So there doesn't seem to be consistency. And, you know, it was only the large, you know, better off, you know, maybe more resources, state societies that do it. You know, there are others that have always been active. The Maryland Society, for example, is one of the 6 state societies that never went dormant, has always been pretty robust, but, you know, for whatever reason, never felt the need or want to make their own eagle. I don't have a good answer to that, unfortunately.
There are examples that were not members, but they still purchased one sort of secretly. Is that thing, like for fake ones?
Oh, have you ever found non-members having eagles or fake eagles? I don't know. I mean, so you kind of have to draw a line at 1902 for what would be considered sort of an authorized eagle, because that's really the first time the General Society tries to enforce a sort of regular protocol, which I will say is enforced today if a new eagle type wants to be created by one of the state societies. So prior to 1902, I mean, like I said, it really was anybody who wanted, any member, any state society, even any jeweler who just saw a market could just decide to make and sell their own, and that was happening. So since 1902, I'm not aware of any sort of fake or sort of non approved eagle out there. There certainly they end up in the hands of non-members primarily just because of the auction market. I mean, these more historical examples, and they don't have to be 18th century examples, but Tiffany eagles, for example, the Arthur's Bertrand, they commonly come up on the market. They're on eBay. They're collectibles. And so, you know, any collector, regardless of their relationship to the society, can buy those. Hopefully they don't wear them, because that is sort of a something that, you know, is taken very, very seriously as the right of a member to portray themselves as a member of this organization by wearing the eagle. But simply having collected it, you know, is something that happens. Any other questions? The history of the Moseley eagle. So for any of, I'll say, for any of you interested in the history of the eagle and even the minutia of some of these different types, the Bible so far for us has been a book published in 1998 written by Minor Myers Jr., who was a member of the society, called simply The Insignia of the Society of the Cincinnati, color illustrated book. And he did some groundbreaking research. He was the first to put together the fact that Jeremiah Andrews had made eagles with what his type actually looked like, and put that together. So this reference might come from that book, because he knew of, and a number of the things he was picturing, he only knew from photographs, and in some cases, he only knew from old photographs. And at the time, that eagle was one of them. So I don't remember the exact name of the member, but this is mid-19th century. I want to say it's like Edward Scott Mosley, something like that. He was a hereditary member, and his eagle seems to be unique, although also sort of an early attempt to replicate one of the original L'Enfant eagles. And it did appear, I want to say at Sotheby's, maybe about 10, 15 years ago, and was sold. I'm sorry to say, not to us. But so exciting in the sense to see it in color, know it exists. It's out there somewhere. But I don't know anything more about, was that a one-off that Mosley just wanted to have made for himself, or who even made it? That's what I know about that one. Sure. Not the original Knox eagle, which is not in our collections. The General Henry Knox Museum in Thomaston, Maine owns Knox's original eagle, which is like Tillman's, one of those kind of classic early French L'Enfant type eagles. So in modern terms, and the question was, do we understood that the eagle ceremonially worn today by our Secretary General was a Knox eagle, as Henry Knox was the first Secretary General of the Society. So it's not the original. In modern years, our Vice President General and Treasurer General and Secretary General all have a sort of ceremonial eagle that goes with their position. All three of those are modern reproductions of eagles. So it is a modern made sort of Tench Tillman style eagle on the Knox, in that case, on a ribbon that replicates the pretty large, lovely eagle ribbon that is depicted in Charles Wilson Peele's portrait of Knox from 1784, where he's wearing his eagle. But it's not the original. Only of the current general officers, only the diamond eagle worn by the President General is an original 18th century inheritance. All right. I would say for any in the room, if you have any more questions, come on up after the talk. Be happy to talk with you more and see these three examples we have here, in addition to the ones in our current exhibition. And for anyone not here in person, anyone else who has any burning Eagles questions, I'm always happy to hear them. So please email me or call. And thank you all again for being here.